Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're looking at Immanuel Kant today. And specifically, we're going to look at his view of reason. This can be put in as part of my series on surviving the dark age of the mind, because Kant ends up having a low view of reason, even though he starts off by saying he's going to defend reason from David Hume. His critique of pure reason tells us about the limits of reason and gives us what he calls a transcendental argument. So we're going to look at all those things: his view of reason, his understanding of the transcendental argument, and then his antinomy of reason, which ends up in a kind of skepticism about reason's abilities to know God. This is from his Critique of Pure Reason, the Great Book series, and this comes from three different sections in that series, I believe, in the critique. I believe you'll see a page number as we're going here. Yeah, in case you want to look that up. I know it's available for free online also. So I started here because he says all this is of pure reason and the seat of the transcendental illusory appearance. All our knowledge begins with sense, proceeds thence to understanding, and ends with reason, beyond which nothing higher can be discovered in the human mind for elaborating the matter of intuition and subjecting it to the highest unity of thought. So 3 parts: sense, understanding, and reason, the highest part. Now there, he's already using reason differently than it's classically used. Classically, it means the laws of thought, like identity and non-contradiction. He's not using it that way, because you'd use those laws of thought in the level he calls understanding. You'd have to use those laws of thought to make sense of your senses. You're sensing a computer, not a non-computer. So we already are left wondering here, well, wait a minute. What does he mean by reason? Well, reason is going to be that which comprehends the understanding even. It's the faculty humans have that they use to give an ultimate unity to everything. But he's going to say that faculty ends up in contradictions. And we'll have to see how he tries to relieve those contradictions. So people pick up on that aspect of Kant, and they'll say, yeah, reason ends up in contradictions, so we need scripture. So that's sort of the Van Tillian stream of Kantianism. He's a Kantian, and they'll say, yeah, reason just ends up in contradictions. You have to have scripture. Now, reason as of the understanding, there's merely a formal, that is, logical use in which it makes abstraction of all content of cognition. So reason begins with general abstract things. And one of the things he wants to bridge is what is called the synthetic a priori, which means a priori means knowledge you have, but not from experience. And synthetic means it applies to the world. It's not just analytic. So the 2 pairs he gives us are analytic, which is just the definitions of words. So you could know that a triangle has 3 angles, but not know if there are any triangles in the world. And the synthetic has to do with what's actually existing. That's one pair. The second pair is the a priori, which means not from experience, prior to experience. And then the a posteriori, from experience. So it makes sense to people to say, I understand how we can have the a posteriori be synthetic. I went out and I experienced triangles. But is there anything that reason gives us which is not from experience but applies to the world? That's the question he's really struggling with, and especially as it relates to the being of God, or to the immortality of the soul, or to free will. Are these things that we can know by reason? Or is reason only about abstractions, what he calls speculative reason? So here he gives a definition of reason and logic. In the former part of our transcendental logic, we define the understanding to be the faculty of rules. So understanding is what uses rules, like logical rules. Reason may be distinguished from understanding as the faculty of principles, the principles which even give us those rules. Now, in one way, I think he's getting close to the laws of thought there, except for he puts it at the, so to speak, the highest level instead of what guides every level. But the laws of thought, identity, non-contradiction, excluded mill, are what gives us the rules of logic. So sometimes people say, I'm going to use the law of non-contradiction, and they call it logic. And I'll point out, well, that's actually a law of thought. It's what gives us any other thought, including the laws of logic. So then he gets into a discussion here of what a principle is. And for him, mathematical, especially geometrical axioms, are the highest example because they come out of pure intuition, like there is only one line, one straight line between 2 points. That's an intuition, but it's also synthetic. It applies to the world. So he uses math as an example of what we need to try to figure out. How do we go from pure intuition to something about in the world? So he says, if we consider these principles of the pure understanding in relation to their origin, we shall find them to be anything rather than cognitions from perceptions. So they're not from perception. They're from pure intuition. So how do we get to synthetical cognitions from conceptions the understanding cannot supply? And they alone are entitled to be called principles. So we're going to see what he articulates as those principles. Now, he considers law here, including the civil laws. We have lots of civil laws on the books, but we want to know what principles give us those civil laws. If you figure out there's like 10 principles, all 600 laws are based on, then you've made some advance to comprehension, to unity. And the laws of thought, I'm putting this in here, he doesn't mention this, but the laws of thought do provide that unity for the laws of logic. So he's aiming for that kind of level of understanding of principles. And here he defines reason. Reason, therefore, never applies directly to experience or to any sensuous object. Its object is, on the contrary, the understanding, to the manifold cognition of which it gives a unity a priori, not by experience, by means of conceptions, a unity which may be called rational unity, and which is of a nature very different from that of the unity produced by the understanding. So again, senses, reason doesn't apply to those. That's the understanding, which is getting information from the senses. But that information is all particular. The comprehend and the understanding tries to make it into a system, and the reason comprehends that and tries to make that into one manifold cognition a priori. So what are some of these principles that he's going to tell us about? So he says, he goes over these things. Syllogisms, in every reasoning or syllogism, there is a fundamental proposition. Afterwards, a second drawn from it, and finally the conclusion. So the fundamental proposition is also called the major premise, and then a minor premise, and they lead to a conclusion. So where do we get this major premise from? He gives an example. All men are mortal. In that is contained some men are mortal. If all of them are, then also some of them are. And nothing that is not mortal is a man. All of those are contained in this first, both of those are contained in this first one. So that's a conclusion of reason. On the other hand, the proposition all the learned or learned are mortal is not contained in that first one. All men are mortal. And it could only be deduced from the main proposition by means of a mediating judgment. So in every syllogism, I first cogitate a rule, the major, by means of the understanding. So in that understanding, you put together the meaning of the words, men, mortal. In the next place, I subsume a cognition under the condition of the rule. That's the minor premise. And by means of a judgment. And finally, I determine my cognition by means of the predicate of the rule. You draw an inference and you have your conclusion. I determine it a priori by means of reason. So the relations, therefore, which the major proposition as the rule represents between a cognition and its condition constitute the different kinds of syllogisms. So that's a quick overview of syllogistic logic, the different kinds of categorical statements and the inferences that can be drawn from them are all underneath reason. But how do we know that applies to the real world? So far, what he's saying is just classical logic. Let's see, what does he add to that helps us, that he thinks helps us against Hume? Because Hume would say, yeah, sure, we have those things, but we don't know if that applies to the real world or not. So he says, this is the question which we have at present to answer. Manifold variety of rules and unity of principles is a requirement of reason for the purpose of bringing the understanding into complete accordance with itself, just as understanding subjects the manifold content of intuition to conceptions and thereby introduces connection into it. So the question we have is, what unity can we give to the many different rules of logic? And that's what is reason. So this principle prescribes no law to objects and does not contain any ground of the possibility of cognizing or of determining them as such, but is merely a subjective law for the proper arrangement of the content of the understanding. Again, so just purely subjective, meaning we don't know if it applies to the world or just to how we understand things. Is reason just a set of rules that we made up to live by? I remember one time an atheist wanted to debate me, and I asked him a few questions to see what the debate would be like. And pretty soon it turned out this is what he thought. He thought that reason is just something we make up. And he said, no, instead of that, we have to go by science. And I pointed out, well, wait a minute, science is just using the laws of thought and applying them to the experimental method. And he's like, he didn't think, he's like, no. And I said, well, look, if you think reason's made up, then there'd be no way to have a debate. There'd be no basis for us to interact. So the principle of pure reason is evidently synthetical. Remember, I said that was one of the things, synthetical, applying to the world. For analytically, the conditioned certainly relates to some condition, but not to the unconditioned. Whereas this principle applies to all things, unconditioned and conditioned. This principle also, from this principle, there also must originate different synthetical propositions of which the pure understanding is perfectly ignorant, for it has to do only with the objects of possible experience, the cognition and the synthesis of which is always conditioned. So we come up to the limits of reason now in what is possible understanding, possible experience, and what is actual. So the principle resulting from the highest principle of pure reason will, however, be transcendental in relation to phenomenon. That is to say, it will be impossible to make any adequate empirical use of this principle. It transcends all cognition. It makes all cognition possible. You don't use experience to prove the transcendental. So when he gets to his principles, those are what makes experience and understanding possible, not proven by that. And you can start to see the transcendental argument right there, formulating. We already saw in another video Aristotle using a transcendental argument for the laws of thought. Kant here is going to use it differently. He says this: the solution of these problems is our task in transcendental dialectic, which we are about to expose even at its source, that lies deep in human reason. We shall divide it into two parts: transcendental conceptions, and dialectical syllogisms. So I'm going to look especially at the antinomies of pure reason and see how he says pure reason ends up in these contradictions and breaks down. Now, the transcendental principles, he says, through them alone are cognition and the determination of object possible. It is from them, accordingly, that we receive material for reasoning, and antecedently to them we possess no a priori conceptions of objects from which they might be deduced. So again, he thinks he solved, with this understanding of the transcendental, Hume's problem. Hume said we have all these logical rules. We don't know if they apply to the world or just our thinking. And he's saying our thinking about anything presupposes some laws, call it reason. Reason is transcendental. You don't prove reason from the world. Your ability to think about the world presupposes reason. So he says the aim of rational conceptions is the comprehension, as that of the conceptions of understanding is the understanding of perception. So where you try to understand your perceptions, how a computer operates, what the buttons do, reason is aimed at comprehension, which is bringing together all things into unity. comprehending, understanding, all the rules of understanding underneath one universal. Now, he gets from here into discussion about Plato and ideas. Real quick before that, sorry. We shall distinguish the categories of pure reason by a new name and call them transcendental ideas. So that gets from there, it gets him into this idea of Plato and Platonic ideas. And he calls him the sublime philosopher. Plato perceived very clearly that our faculty of cognition has a feeling of a much higher vocation than that of merely spelling out phenomena according to synthetic unity. There are these perfect ideas, and we never, like triangle, and we never actually experience triangle. We see things that look like triangles, but if you were to actually measure them, you'd find them to be imperfect. But triangle-ness is actually perfect. It has 180 degrees in its three angles. So where do we get the transcendental ideas from? Well, we have observed from the natural relation which the transcendental use of our category of our cognition in syllogisms as well as in judgment must have to the logical, that there are three kinds of dialectical arguments corresponding to the three modes of conclusion by which reason attains to cognition on principles, and that in all it is the business of reason to ascend from the conditioned synthesis beyond which the understanding never proceeds to the unconditioned, which the understanding never can reach. The limits of pure reason, going beyond the conditioned synthesis to the unconditioned, which reason can't reach. Or that understanding can never reach. Understanding is always locked in the particulars. Reason is what takes us to the unconditioned, to the general, the speculative. So he explains some of that next. General relations, the relation to the subject, the relation to objects, either as phenomenon or objects of thought in general. And then I go here next to, in this footnote, he says, the science of metaphysics has for the proper object of its inquiries only three grand ideas: God, freedom, and immortality. And it aims at showing that the second conception, conjoined with the first, must lead to the third as a necessary conclusion. So God, freedom, immortality. If you have freedom and God, you end up with immortality. All the other subjects with which it occupies itself are merely means for the attainment and realization of these ideas. It does not require these ideas for the construction of a science of nature, but on the contrary, for the purpose of passing beyond the sphere of nature. A complete insight into and comprehension of them would render theology, ethics, and thought, and the conjunction of both, religion, solely dependent on the speculative faculty of reason. In a synthetic representation of these ideas, the above-mentioned arrangement, the synthetical one, would be the most suitable. But in the investigation, which must necessarily precede it, the analytical, which reserves the arrangement, would be better adapted to one purpose, as in it we should proceed from that which experience immediately presents to us psychology, to cosmology, and thence to theology. So a long footnote there to read you, to give you the idea, though. These are going to end up being the transcendentals: God, freedom, and immortality. There must be presupposed to make sense of anything else. So you can see there, if you're aware of Cornelius Van Til, Van Tillian apologetics. So he says, now the transcendental subjective reality, at least of the pure conceptions of reason, rests upon the fact that we are led to such ideas by a necessary procedure of reason. It's necessarily the case that you have to presuppose God, freedom, and immortality to make sense of practical reason, especially. He's going to talk about practical rationality, not pure rationality. And that's a kind of argument that he's giving. And so from there, we're going to get into the antinomy of pure reason next. I'll make a separate video for that, the antinomy of pure reason, because here's what happens. Reason has to presuppose these. It can't prove them. When reason tries to prove them, what we might call classical natural theology, when you give arguments for God's existence, when reason tries to prove God exists, it ends up in contradictions, antinomies. And so that's why he's going to say instead we have to just presuppose them. Now, that's why I've connected this up with the idea of a dark age of the mind. The idea that reason can't know God, it must just presuppose God. And then when reason tries to know God, it ends up in contradictions. From there, we're going to get a noticeable descent into the skeptical and fideist positions. Knowledge is not possible, so don't believe, or knowledge isn't possible, you got to believe something. But reason, either way, they'll say reason is too weak, it's insufficient, it can't prove anything, you need this instead. Assuming, presupposing. Now, that's different than what Aristotle did. Aristotle said there's a transcendental argument for reason, and that transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction. He didn't use the word transcendental, but I'm showing it has that same outline. You have to assume it because in any thought, you're using it. So we'll compare that, and that's the laws of thought, to the transcendentals that Kant proposes. And what I'll argue is that Kant's presuppositions or transcendentals presuppose reason. You have to start with reason as the laws of thought, or you can't make sense of anything. And it turns out that his antinomies aren't successful. There's not really these contradictions. So that's a cliffhanger for next time. Thanks for joining me looking at Kant's view of reason.